We also tested THC and CBD, the two main ingredients in medical marijuana or in marijuana in general, and found that they were pretty weak, but these synthetic compounds were pretty effective at killing the cells. And so it sort of sets the stage for beginning to explore the idea that there may be value in medical marijuana in treating cancer.
That's Dr. Kent Vrana, Penn State College of Medicine professor, whose research team recently published a study that looked at cannabinoids and their effect on colon cancer cells. This is the Lancaster Farming
Industrial Hemp
podcast, and I am your host, Eric Herlog, digital editor at Lancaster Farming. And on today's show, we'll listen to my interview with Dr. Vrana about cannabis and cancer and much more. But first, the news. Okay, so yesterday, the FDA released a statement from their commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, on new steps to advance the agency's continued evaluation of potential regulatory pathways for cannabis-containing and cannabis-derived products. It begins, in recent years, we've seen a growing interest in the development of therapies and other FDA-regulated consumer products derived from cannabis and its components, including CBD. This interest spans the range of product categories that the agency regulates. For example, we've seen or heard of interest in products containing cannabis or cannabis derivatives that are marketed as human drugs, dietary supplements, conventional foods, animal foods and drugs, and cosmetics, among other things. We also recognize that stakeholders are looking to the FDA for clarity on how our authorities apply to such products, what pathways are available to market such products lawfully under these authorities, and how the FDA is carrying out its responsibility to protect public health and safety with respect to such products. And then I'll just scroll through a little bit, blah, 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 Farm Bill, blah, 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 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Here it is. Today, the FDA is announcing a number of important new steps and actions to advance our consideration of a framework for the lawful marketing of appropriate cannabis and cannabis-derived products under our existing authorities. And these new steps include a public hearing on May 31st, the formation of a high-level internal agency working group to explore potential pathways for dietary supplements and/or conventional foods containing CBD to be lawfully marketed. They'll also have updates to their webpage. And then the issuance of multiple warning letters to companies marketing CBD products with egregious and unfounded claims that are aimed at vulnerable populations. And then it goes on to say that the FDA has issued warning letters in collaboration with the Federal Trade Commission to 3 companies: Advanced Spine and Pain LLC, doing business as Relievus, NutraPure LLC, and Pot Network Holdings Incorporated. So you know we'll follow this story closely, and of course we'll check in on that public hearing on May 31st. All right, other news. So there's been a few hemp farmer meetings lately in the area here of southeastern Pennsylvania. Last week I told you about the meeting with Groff North America, where they had a hemp supper and they were explaining to farmers why they should grow fiber for their new hemp train out there in York County. And then last week, there was a meeting at the Shady Maple Smorgasbord with Floyd's of Leadville. The place was packed. It looked like over 200 people. Floyd and Jake, whom you met here on this show back in episode 22, they were joined by a farmer named Wayne Bendis and Corey Fitz from PCR Labs, a cannabis testing company in Allentown. They got up and they just sort of, talked briefly about what's involved in growing cannabis and what they are looking for. Really, the main point of the meeting was to get everybody to fill out this questionnaire. And once Floyd's gets all the questionnaires, they're going to sort through them and then, weed people out and then really pick the farmers that they want to work with. So it was less of a learning session for farmers and more of, a getting to know you session for Floyd's. Some farmers I talked to after the meeting were kind of annoyed that they didn't get as much nuts and bolts farming as they wanted, but this is how Jake Sittler puts it.
I sat up there and we went over the whole entire night. I mean, that's like literally teaching someone how to win the Tour de France in 2 hours.
And then last night I attended another meeting, and this one was put on by Steve Groff, the cover crop coach that you met here on this show, episode 24, along with a farmer named Andre Fry, whose family has been farming in Lancaster for 9 generations. and who's been farming hemp in Colorado for the past few years. So this was a whole lot more nuts and bolts farming, from soil testing and prep to planting techniques, equipment, watering, all that stuff. And they're hosting another one of these meetings on April 12th, and you can find more information about that on lancasterfarming.com. Okay, so that brings me up to speed. We'll take a quick break, and then we'll get into my interview with Dr. Kent Vrana. Dr. Kent Vrana, welcome to the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast. Could you introduce yourself for us?
Certainly, Eric. I am the Elliott S. Bissell Professor and Chair of the Department of Pharmacology at the Penn State College of Medicine. I've been here as Chair for 15 years now, having come from Wake Forest University in 2004.
And the reason I invited you on our show today is because I was sent a link to a Penn State news article. It was sent to me by a local processor of hemp. He wanted me to read this because it sounded like good news for the hemp industry, and the title is "Cannabinoid Compounds May Inhibit Growth of Colon Cancer Cells." And your team is responsible for that research. Could you tell us about it?
Certainly. So the Department of Pharmacology here at the College of Medicine is interested in a number of different things, but primarily cancer and neurobiology. And so for a number of years, I've been very interested in substance abuse in general, but in recent years, I've been fascinated by this growing interest in medical marijuana and its potential uses. Mm-hmm. So my team and I, led by Wesley Ropp-Konsavage, did a series of experiments using synthetic cannabinoids. These are artificial cannabis, or I should say tetrahydrocannabinol-like compounds. So they're not found in marijuana, but they're related. And we had a library, or assembled a library, of about 370 of those molecules, and just asked a simple question: could any of those work to inhibit the growth of colon cancer cells in the tissue culture dish? So these experiments weren't done in humans, nor were they done in animals, but they were done with human cells. Mm-hmm. And what we found was that screening through these 370 compounds, we found 10 who seemed to have reasonable activity at inhibiting or killing cancer cells, these colon cancer cell lines, of which we had 7. And so by comparison, then we also tested THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, mm-hmm. and CBD, cannabidiol, the two main ingredients in medical marijuana, or in marijuana in general, mm-hmm. and found that they were pretty weak, but these synthetic compounds were pretty effective at killing the cells. And so it sort of sets the stage for beginning to explore the idea that there may be value in medical marijuana in treating cancer.
Okay, so I'm curious about the synthetic nature of these cannabinoids. Why did you choose the synthetic varieties rather than the ones naturally occurring in the plant?
So that's a great question. It turns out that several decades ago, when we discovered THC and CBD in the marijuana plant, drug companies began trying to tweak that structure to make compounds that might turn into medicines. And in fact, both THC and CBD are approved medicines in their pure form for a couple of different applications. And but we wanted to start with these synthetic compounds for a couple of reasons. The first is that these compounds tend to be a lot more potent than THC and CBD at the cannabinoid receptors. And so we wanted to maximize our chances of finding something that would kill the cancer cells. The other thing is that the 100 or so different cannabinoid compounds that are found in medical marijuana are very poorly characterized. And in fact, I am working on my DEA license now to get the government-supplied marijuana so we can begin looking at those compounds, because I think there might be something going on there that we're just not aware of. We were able to test THC and CBD, and as I say, they weren't very potent. But I think there will be other molecules because there are 100 plus related compounds in marijuana. But for now, we could get this library of synthetic compounds, which we know are very potent at the cannabinoid receptors, and that's where we started.
I read the article and I've looked at your study, but I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, so it's sort of above me by a few levels there. And you said there was 10 different compounds, but there was one in particular that seemed to inhibit the cell division. Can you talk a bit about that one?
Yes, of course. Let me clarify that. There were 10 compounds out of the 370 that had comparable activities. Interestingly enough, they fall into three basic structures. They're subtly different. Each of the 10 is subtly different, but they fall into three main structures. And so these are compounds that we know bind to the cannabinoid receptors, the same receptors that THC and CBD bind to, but that these synthetic compounds don't have the same structure as THC and CBD. So they had activity, and when you study these compounds in the tissue culture dish, they sort of point the direction that you want to go in terms of testing. And so we'll be working to modify these molecules to try and make them more potent. But for now, this is how we got started, is just screening a broad range of different molecules and then figuring out which ones appeared to have activity.
And so the activity in the colon cancer cells, it stopped the cell division? That was the most promising result there?
Yeah. And so given that we know the activity of these molecules, we thought, okay, if they're working through the cannabinoid receptors, can we block that by putting in molecules that are called antagonists that block the receptors to try and prevent the activity? And what was very interesting is that the molecules were not blocked by traditional anti-cannabinoid compounds. So we think they're working in a different way. That doesn't change the fact that they inhibited the colon cancers. It's not going to be the canonical or the normal way we think about cannabinoids working.
Can you explain the cannabinoid receptors and the sort of cannabinoidal system in the human body?
Of course. So most botanicals, most compounds that are derived from plants work on our bodies by interfering or stimulating normal systems. And so, for instance, cocaine works on our dopamine system, and alcohol works on our GABA or gamma aminobutyric acid system. It turns out that marijuana and the cannabinoids work on a set of receptors found throughout our bodies that are involved in maintaining our relationship with our environment. We make cannabinoid-like compounds that serve to regulate neuronal activity and inflammation. These appear to be our normal systems for managing our bodies in some respects. So what happens is when you smoke pot or you use medical marijuana, when you use those compounds, what they're doing is getting into the body and then working through endogenous systems. And so there are a number of different receptors. These are proteins that we find in our body, in our brains, and in our circulation and on our cells that sense the presence of the cannabinoid and then have an effect on the target cell. And so that's precisely what's happening. We have two main kinds of cannabinoid receptors called CB1 and CB2. CB1 is found primarily in the brain, and that's responsible for psychoactivity, for getting high when you smoke pot. The CB2 receptor is found throughout the body and appears to regulate inflammation. And so that may be the source of some of the potential activities of medical marijuana on reducing inflammation and helping with pain. And then there are a couple of other receptors that we're still trying to figure out, but one of the most intriguing ones that is affected by the cannabinoids is the capsaicin receptor. That's the one that allows us to taste hot peppers. And so it makes a lot of sense that medical marijuana may be helpful for pain, for instance, because it works on a pain receptor, this heat or hot receptor that we have in our bodies. So the bottom line is that when we use medical marijuana, what we're doing is modulating the normal receptors in our body, some of which may be out of whack, and that's what's leading to inflammation or to pain or for one of the applications to seizure disorders, for instance.
That's interesting. Now, you keep saying medical marijuana is, in your mind, is there a difference between, I mean, apart from the levels of THC, but medical marijuana and, let's just say, the cannabis plant in general? Do you make a distinction in your work?
We ultimately will, because marijuana comes in a lot of different types. And so, for instance, your listeners are very interested in hemp, for instance, which is the cannabis plant, but it has very low levels, less than 0.3% of THC, the psychoactive. So you don't get high from smoking hemp. And hemp has tremendous potential in a variety of different things, including fabrics and ropes and fibers and things like that. But it also contains high levels of cannabidiol, CBD. And that's the component of cannabis that doesn't get you high, but appears to play a role in modulating pain and inflammation. So what we're ultimately going to find is that marijuana extracts will have varying effects depending on whether they're high in THC or low in THC, and high in CBD and low in CBD. And in addition, there are all these other compounds that we haven't characterized at all yet that are found in the plant that may have effects that we need to figure out. So cannabis is cannabis. Its use as a medicine will depend on which strain you use. And so, for instance, in Colorado, they've been doing a lot of plant husbandry to create cannabis plants that contain huge quantities of THC, explicitly for the purpose of getting people high. But the fact of the matter is that modulating that ratio of THC to CBD will have differing effects in differing systems. And so lots of work needs to be done on determining which one of those is optimal.
So where do you see your research going from here?
Well, right now we're going to be taking two approaches. The first is that we're right now trying to figure out if the synthetic cannabinoids are killing colon cells, but not through traditional receptors. What is it that they're doing? And so we're doing experiments right now to try and tease that apart, because it's entirely possible that they're working through some other kind of receptor or some other kind of protein. The other thing will be to start taking those structures, and our department has a number of very talented medicinal chemists who can take the parent structure that we identified in our screen of that library of 370 compounds, and then start tweaking those compounds to either make them more potent or to make them more bioavailable, so we can start thinking about turning them into a potential drug down the road. Those are the two things we're doing right away. But as you may have seen, the College of Medicine has been approved as an academic clinical research center under the medical marijuana law. And so we're one of 8 in the state. And what we'll be doing is working with a corporate partner to better understand what some of these other molecules are. So we're going to be branching out into things like inflammatory bowel disease, where there seems to be some potential for medical marijuana, different models of pain, in an attempt to try and reduce the amount of opiates that have to be used in the chronic pain situation, and then other applications, including cancer. So I don't know if you saw, but the Commonwealth approved something like 21 different diseases that could be treated with medical marijuana. And so we're going to be working on a subset of those moving into the future.
You mentioned that you're getting your DEA license so you can work with actual marijuana. And so would you move away from the synthetics and you'll focus on the naturally occurring cannabinoid compounds?
I think we'll probably be doing both, but more on the natural, primarily because the synthetics have been tried in many cases as potential drugs and found to have side effects. And so while they give us some hint as to what's going on, and they may tell us the kinds of targets that we want to go after for cancer, let's say, humans are going to be using marijuana extracts. And so what I'm keenly interested in is dissecting what the many compounds are that are found in marijuana, because I think some of these minor components may have considerable potency that we're just not familiar with. Lots of folks have been working on THC and CBD. As I say, they've both been approved for certain diseases. And so we're very interested in taking the marijuana and the hemp plant apart and figuring out what molecules might be there.
Can you talk a bit about the entourage effect?
The entourage effect gets a lot of attention. It's this notion that THC and CBD and or CBD do not work alone, but they work with other things. The problem is that we just have no evidence of that. What we know, for instance, is that THC, under the drug name Marinol, is used to stimulate appetite. It is true that smoking pot gives you the munchies, and so that is an approved FDA-approved drug for helping folks with cancer and with chemotherapy-induced loss of appetite to keep their weight up, keep their nutrition up. Epidiolex, which is pure CBD, has just in the last several months been approved for intractable seizure disorders in children. So we know those two compounds work in those settings. What a lot of people believe is that it's not just THC or CBD, but some of these other compounds. And while that may be true, no one has looked at that in detail. And so, for instance, one approach that we'll take, or that many people could take, is to take an extract of marijuana, of cannabis, that contains a variety, hundreds of different molecules, and then show that it has an effect. Let's use cancer as an example. And it inhibits the cancer cells. You can then chemically start separating the molecules into batches and then test them and see which of the batches still have activity. If, for instance, you found that separating marijuana extract into 5 different buckets of compounds and none of them had activity, that provides evidence for the entourage effect. And then what you can do is mix the different buckets together in different combinations to find the ones that are effective.
Okay.
And you repeat that process over and over again until you get down to just a handful of molecules that have an activity. And so that's how we'll get at which of the components of marijuana are effective. The problem is that the FDA is not going to approve marijuana as a drug because it's not a pure compound. And so we've got to try and figure out what it is that is having this effect. And so with the DEA license, the government has a sole source at the University of Mississippi for providing marijuana to researchers. And so with that license, I will get product from Mississippi, and then I can start extracting it myself and start to take it apart to test this entourage effect.
I want to ask you to speculate on something here. I know it's probably not what you normally do, but where do you think we would be medically if the cannabis prohibition had never been put in place?
Medically, I don't know where we would be. As you know, there are something like 30 states and the District of Columbia that have now approved some form of medical marijuana. The big problem for us is that it remains a Schedule I drug, is classified with PCP and LSD, and so it's very, very difficult to do research on it. And so in terms of speculation, it certainly would be easier to study the effects of marijuana, medical marijuana, if it weren't a Schedule I drug. And so what we're relying on now is the states to provide an environment where people can begin to understand how it might work. There's so precious little careful scientific data on the effects of medical marijuana. Everyone has an apocryphal story of a loved one or an acquaintance who used marijuana and something was cured. But there have been very few carefully controlled clinical trials, and that would be so much easier if the drug were not a Schedule 1 drug. I've been gratified that the Commonwealth, when they passed Act 16 in 2016, put in strong provisions for doing research, and we're almost there. The clinical registrants, which are the corporate partners, and the ACRCs, the academic clinical research centers, are very close to being. Those partnerships are very close to being approved now, and we'll begin to start doing some of this research. But it's very difficult with the prohibitions in place right now.
Do you, I was going to ask, do you even think it should be scheduled like that? But I know what you're going to say. Does it even belong in this Schedule 1 with those other drugs?
Absolutely not. Although I do not, and I'll just be fully forthright with you, I do not approve the notion of recreational marijuana. Mm-hmm. It is not a safe drug. It is certainly alcohol is a tremendously detrimental drug that is legal, but that's not an excuse to make marijuana legal for recreational purposes. Mm-hmm. But it is not justified, in my opinion, to be a Schedule 1 drug. Certainly not CBD. CBD is just because CBD is non-psychoactive. It's just recently been descheduled to Schedule 5, but only in the form of Epidiolex, only in the form of the drug itself. So my personal bias is it shouldn't be a Schedule 1. It probably should be a Schedule 3. But the fact of the matter is it is now, and that makes it a federal felony to work with it without very tight controls. And so, but we have seen a lot of detrimental results of having legalized recreational marijuana. I just read a paper that came out last week from Colorado that showed a huge uptick in emergency room visits because of edible marijuana, recreational marijuana extracts. And so I think we have to be very, very careful about legalizing recreational, but I just love what the Commonwealth did in terms of providing for regulation of medical marijuana while providing access to patients who may benefit from it, and then also including careful research to understand how it's working.
Is there anything else you would like to share with our audience about your work or thoughts on medical marijuana?
Well, I think what's important to understand is that we need to understand how the molecules are working, but at the same time, what we really lack are situations in which we have careful placebo-controlled trials. And what I mean by that is someone with a disease comes in and wants to and wishes to participate in a clinical trial where they won't know and their doctor won't know whether they're getting the drug or a placebo, a sugar pill, if you will. And so for a month, they could be tested and we could assess the effectiveness of the medication. And then at the end of that month, the code, quote unquote, would be broken. They would know whether they got placebo or drug, and then they would go on drug. But we need those careful controlled studies because so much of what medical marijuana would be used for, things like pain and anxiety and IBD even, those things we have no control over what the medical marijuana is doing. And so if you smoke pot, and you get high, that's going to shape how you perceive the drug working. So what we need are some extracts that aren't there to get you high, but rather to treat the symptoms, and then to carefully control whether you get drug or not, so that we can prove that medical marijuana is effective. It's been used as a drug for centuries, millennia even. And but we don't know how it works, and we certainly don't know for which specific indications it works. As I say, it's been approved for 20 plus diseases in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but I'm confident it's not going to work for all of them. It's not a cure-all for all disease, but it undoubtedly will have some activities. But we need to support the research that will figure out which ones it's effective for.
Okay.
And I guess the final thing I would say is that no one should rely on medical marijuana to treat their disease if there are other treatments available, because it might help, but it's not going to replace other things. And so my argument is always to carefully let your doctor know that you're using medical marijuana, and then at the same time make sure that you're getting the standard of care, the best that we have to offer now. Unfortunately, for many of these diseases, we just don't have good approaches right now, and medical marijuana may provide some help.
Was your research sponsored or funded by any companies?
No, I've done this research using internal dollars from my endowment. As I mentioned at the outset, I'm the Vassell professor, so I have some independent support there, and using some support from the College of Medicine. And so we have to be careful about that too, is make sure that we're not doing experiments just to prove that something works for a drug company, for instance, but rather to find out what works and what doesn't work. And so we're very careful about that here at the College of Medicine, is managing conflicts of interest so that we make sure that we're reporting the stuff that doesn't work just as well as we're reporting the stuff that does work.
Right. So people might see that Penn State news article and say, oh, that like their takeaway might be THC and CBD have no effect on cancer. But that's not the blanket statement you're making there.
No, I'm just saying that they're not as strong as some of these synthetic compounds, but they may have activity. More importantly, I think that if medical marijuana does work for cancer, it may well be because of either the entourage effect or one of these other molecules that aren't THC or CBD. I don't want to give the impression that CBD and THC, that medical marijuana won't work. THC was virtually without activity. CBD had activity, but it was very, very weak and only partial. That doesn't mean that there's not something else there that might work.
So you were looking at colon cancer cells. How similar or different are those cancer cells to other cancers, and might this research transfer to other cancers?
So they're similar in that they're unregulated epithelial cells. Most cancers are. And so I think it will be applicable, but it won't be one size fits all. We know that because one of my other colleagues has tried this on neuroblastoma cells and glioblastoma cells, and the same compounds don't work exactly the same. A couple of them are effective, but the 10 that we found for colon cells don't all 10 of those don't work for neuroblastoma or glioblastoma. Okay. So I think there'll be some applicability, but generalizability, but not total.
So I interviewed a CEO of a CBD company a couple of months ago, and he mentioned this idea of a cannabinoid. What did he call it? I'm just going to drop the clip in of Gabe Ettinson from Elixinol.
This plant was necessary in our diet, and as a result of not having it, we've experienced higher levels of disease and problems in society that do believe that endocannabinoid deficiency is probably the overarching cause of these problems.
You can hear that whole interview on episode 11 of this podcast. All right, back to my question with Dr. Vrana. Cannabinoidal deficiency that humanity may or may not be suffering now since the prohibition of cannabis. He was thinking that, for thousands of years, we just had this in our diet and sort of in our culture, livestock feed, whatever. Do you think there's any substance there to that idea?
There's no question that Jefferson and Washington were growing hemp on their plantations in Virginia back in the 1700s. We were breeding to enhance the cannabinoids, but this notion that there's now a deficiency in our diet. Our bodies produce two main compounds, anandamide and 2-arachidonyl glycerol. These two compounds are much more potent than THC and CBD, and our bodies make that all the time.
Okay.
So if there's a deficiency, it's because maybe we have evolved over time because our environment has changed so that we make less of that. It's possible, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
But that idea doesn't make any sense to me, because cannabis hasn't been a normal, probably never was a normal component of our diet from a nutritional standpoint. So that's something that I can't buy into. It's an interesting idea.
Right.
And it's clear that in some individuals, let's use pediatric epilepsy, for instance. There's an imbalance in those young people's brains. There's no question about that leads to these seizures. But it's not because they don't have THC in or cannabis in their diet. Otherwise, everybody would have that problem.
Right.
It's just that we can manipulate that system using CBD, using Epidiolex. We can manipulate that system to alleviate some of those seizure disorders. This is an area of free speech, and that's frankly the first time I've heard of that idea. But my first blush response is there are no data to support that.
Yeah, he called it an unscientific idea, but he was still, exploring it anyway.
Well, and exploring is a different matter. And so maybe I was a bit harsh on him, but I just can't imagine how that's possible. But on the other hand, I don't want to shut down sort of scientific inquiry. That
Mm-hmm.
makes sense. If that's a thing, the natural extension is that we should all be putting CBD and THC in our diets, which I do not advocate.
I think what he was talking about was that, back in the old days, the livestock would be eating, hemp seed as their feed, and just it was more in our culture that way, like in our diet, not directly but indirectly through what we eats.
Now that's a great point. There is an ongoing debate now about whether a lot of these, for instance, peanut allergies and things, came about because we've been overly controlling them, and that we have been in the area of infections, we've been too clean, and we're not getting exposed to things now. And so all of that, may be true. Could animals eating cannabis have increased that in our diet? I suppose it's possible, but not to the levels that we see now. When you smoke a joint in Colorado, some of them have almost gram quantities of THC in them. You would never get that naturally if it hadn't been for them enriching it in those plants.
And that was a direct result of the prohibition.
And I admit to that, absolutely. Mm-hmm. So how many of your listeners are in the hemp industry now, do you think?
That's a good question. I know there's a lot of interest. The 2018 Farm Bill made it legal, to grow hemp here. And so the point of this podcast is just sort of to document the birth of this industry. And, so I talk to farmers, I talk to processors, I talk to scientists and doctors, and just to shine a light on what's going on here, because this is fascinating stuff to me. Like it never happens. You never see the birth of an industry like this, and especially one that has so much potential, from medicine to building materials to, you name it. You can pretty much make anything out of this plant if you, believe what people are saying. So it's been my sort of mission to document and to educate and illuminate.
No, you're doing the Lord's work here, because I think it is very important. I think we are living in a transformational time, and so it's great fun to watch. And what I'm hearing from folks who come up to me after I give public presentations on this is that they're having trouble getting highly characterized high CBD product from the dispensaries. Everybody the current dispensaries have immediately jumped on high THC. And then unfortunately, the Secretary of the Department of Health legalized the combustible form of marijuana, which means we're going to have diversion for getting high, probably. But people need to understand that it's not all about getting high and high THC product, but CBD oil that is well characterized, that we know how much is in there and what other kinds of molecules and metals and things like that, for instance. I am deathly afraid of states where the CBD is unregulated and you could just go into a gas station and get CBD oil and you have no idea what's in it. So I love the idea that here in the Commonwealth we're trying to regulate composition of these things. But your kinds of podcasts educate people that it's not all one size does not fit all, and I think that's important.
Right.
How big an audience do you think you have?
Conservatively, I would say several hundred, maybe 1,000. There's not great analytics on this, so I get like some strange metadata that it's like reading tea leaves. Yeah,
no, I understand. But at the same time, this kind of thing enhances our ability to get the word out, and in what is hopefully a rational and reasoned way.
Right.
I'm never on tape gonna bash somebody else's ideas.
Right.
And so I think that's what we've got to do. For instance, when I hear somebody say the entourage effect, yes, there's a good chance that things are working together, but that's code for a lot of people to say that we need to be able to smoke pot so that we can get all of the goodies, all the goodness. And I just want to find some data that says that there really is an entourage effect.
Right.
And so they'll argue, well, THC or Marinol doesn't work by itself. And I would argue, well, maybe THC isn't the active ingredient. Maybe it's one of these others.
Right.
Arguing that you have to have all the goodness in one place in an uncontrolled fashion, because you can't control how much you're getting when you smoke. You don't know what your blood levels of different things are. And so, I just really want to do some high quality research so that we can add value to the literature and to the discussion. And that's what I'm looking forward to doing.
Okay, that's Dr. Kent Vrana, chair of the Department of Pharmacology at Penn State's College of Medicine, where his team recently published a study that showed cannabinoids effectively inhibiting the growth of colon cancer cells. I will post a link to that study on the LancasterFarming.com page for this episode. All right, thank you for listening to today's show. If you have any questions or comments, please email me at podcast@LancasterFarming.com. Hey, also, I'm looking for hemp farmers to talk to. Are you growing hemp this year? Send me an email. I want to hear from you. I want to hear about your operation. I want to hear what's happening. I think there's a lot of people who are curious about what you're going through. So get in touch, please. So, okay, my name is Eric Herlock. I'm the digital editor at Lancaster Farming. And speaking of Lancaster Farming, let's put in a quick call to my editor, Steve Sieber, and see what's on tap for this week's paper.
Hello, Steve Sieber, Lancaster Farming.
Hey, Steve, it's Eric. You're on the podcast. I'm just checking in about stories for this week's paper.
Well, hey, Marty Smith was in our area. He's the president-elect of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. He was in Boalsburg, Pennsylvania, talking to the Pennsylvania Cattlemen's Association about farming next to alligators. He has a farm down in Florida, so that was pretty interesting. And we all remember the rainy weather from last year. Well, it had a negative impact on 85% of Pennsylvania's ag fairs. So we have an article about that and how it's negatively impacting one of our local fairs that's been around for 200 years. And because of the weather and some financial problems, it's going to scale back significantly this year. So those are our big stories this week.
All right. Sounds like another great issue. Thanks.
All right. Thanks for checking in.
Okay. That does it for me. Thank you for listening. And hey, a quick favor. If you know someone who you think would enjoy this podcast, please share it with them. Okay. Thanks. Until next time, I'll see you in the newspaper. This episode of the Lancaster Farming Podcast is copyright 2019, Lancaster Farming. Lancaster Farming is a member of the Steinman Communications family. Today's show was written, edited, recorded, and produced by
Eric Herlock.
Special thanks today go to Floyd Landis and Jake Sittler, Steve Groff and Andre Fry, and the good people at the Stroud Water Research Center. Any music you hear is courtesy of Tin Bird Shadow.
Industrial hemp.